we'll now go to the studies for tonight. I wrote in my Shabbat thought as I was preparing for tonight that one thing that I enjoy doing is reading. Pardon me, I have a bit of a cold. Maybe a little more of the Kiddush wine will help. Pardon me. I've been reflecting on the study of Psalms, and I noticed that one thing I like to do on Facebook is read epigrams, meaning these lists of really wonderful things that people say, lists of quotations. I'm on a Carl Jung page, I'm on a Viktor Frankl page, I'm on a Nietzsche page, and people bring up quotes of these great authors, and I read them and I say, wow, that's great, well put. Thank you for organizing that knowledge. And as I was thinking about tonight, I realized that, pardon me. All right, whatever. If if we have something called unconscious goals, which we can gauge by how we spend our time, one of my unconscious, unplanned goals in life is reading pithy sayings and epigrams on Facebook. And then I began to think about what it means to read epigrams. I know one thing is it's delightful. It's like as opposed to mind candy, uh, like your typical sitcom. This is nourishment for the mind to read a snippet. But the problem is, I noticed I read it, I like it, it rings a bell within me, but I don't actually memorize it, sink into it, and ruminate on it. And that is not such a good thing. And then I think about, well, what's the difference between the way that, let's say, we come at a text here on a Friday night, and that is that when you have a spiritual discipline of text study, you actually go into the text, we analyze the text, we ruminate on the text, we try to understand how the text does its magic, much more like when we study a poem. The second thing is in reading a snippet, an epigram, and again, I love it. I'm not going to stop. I mean, every time I read one, the algorithm sends me five more, and I read five more. It's not the same thing as reading the full poem. For example, the poem we read tonight, you could pull a snippet out of it. There's nothing like actually reading the poem and watching its music from beginning to the end of a poem. Either a beautiful short poem that we read tonight or some some exquisite longer poems that we typically don't do on a Friday night. I think our perhaps our attention spans are a bit limited. Um, but even that would be worthwhile. Shanti, I'm going to ask you: do you do longer, um, I'm thinking like duino elegies, those kinds of things in your spiritual poetry group, or do you more or less keep it to the shorter fare?
It's pretty much similar lengths to what we read here. Once in a while, something longer, but and also the spiritual poetry group, everyone who wants to can read something. So we want to have time for people to read and discuss.
Yeah. Well,
But
I
boy, there's
love.
some great longer ones out there. I mean,
Yeah,
we do read the Passover poem here, which is long because it's just so good and so in accord with what we in our tradition would know about.
right. Good. All right. So, uh, we'll leave it to your discretion. Give me notice because maybe I can form a teaching around a longer poem. But I love the shorter fare. I've
Okay.
always loved reading brief poetry, and short stories. And maybe because I have a short attention span and I'm looking for the payoff as quick as I can get it. But there are times when I know I'm just in the mood to sit and read. The only really long poems I read are by Rilke in the Duino Elegies. And they are extraordinarily difficult to go through, but always oh, very well worth the time. One thing I'm thinking as I'm very close to launching our new set of wisdom work classes is actually having a spiritual poetry class. Shanti, you're invited to be a senior scholar in the class and maybe actually take a session, four sessions devoted to a one of the Duino elegies. It would be so worth your while to learn how to break the code. I didn't read them for a while because I didn't understand them. I was like, I don't understand this, and I want the payoff now. And then when I really took the time to read a text as it deserves to be read, it just reached parts of my soul that I didn't even know existed. So my goal for tonight is to take us into little parts of Psalm 119. And I just want to read a section of the psalm and show you how it works for me as a poem. So if you have a Bible nearby, bring out Psalm 119. The one that I selected for tonight for no good reason other than in my marked up Bible, it's just another one that clearly meant something to me when I was studying. I typically get to this about every 2 years. And I'll be reading from verses 25 through 32 this time around. I also offered if anybody in reading from Psalms found a verse that you liked and you would like to give a little presentation on, you're invited. Lydia, you're going to be ready to go in a little while? Okay, so I'll be calling on you. And we'll just invite people who have prepared a little teaching on a verse from Psalms at the end of my teaching to present your teaching. Okay, so since I'm giving not just reading it, but giving a teaching on it, I want to talk about a few things in Psalms in general, Psalm 119 in particular. And one is that when she mentions God, being here in Israel, it's especially accentuated that people just say, Ani chiloni, I'm secular, I don't believe in God. I've discovered I don't know what they mean by that, because they oftentimes turn out like in the States, some of the most spiritual people who are connected to some kind of a divine truth, but because of the Orthodox secular schism here, people mark off the boundary. Those people keep the law and they believe in God. I don't keep the law. I don't believe in God. And I mentioned I find that actually not an interesting way for people to talk. It doesn't tell me anything about the person, because there are superficial people who are secular and superficial people who are religious, and there are extraordinarily deep people who are secular and religious, and marking themselves off by this, I think, false dichotomy, I don't think does them any good, and it certainly doesn't tell me anything about the person. So when I think of the word God, because my personal theology, is so complex, so read it in halakha. The divine is not something I believe in, that I have a set of propositions about. So people say, people say to me, do you believe in God? Tamamin. And like when I was saying in English, I say, I don't know about believing. I call myself a God knower. Now, if you're interested in this idea of a knower of God, I'll refer you to the psalm that we're not going to study tonight, but just in case you've never spent time with this really, I think, deep and suggestive idea, you can mark down Psalm 36. And in Psalm 36, at the end of a section that I've taught many times, that goes from verse 8 to verse 11. It says in verse 11, after an exquisite poetic selection, which we will discuss another time, it says the following. Mashoch hazdecha liot echa, draw your chesed, your loving kindness, liot echa, to those who know you, your knowers, betzitkatecha liyisrei lev, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. We also have in the early morning liturgy that we should all be Yod'eh Hashem, knowers of God. So ever since I became familiar with the concept that there are what I call the believers, and again, I'm not saying this is what it means, but the term believer tends to mean the following: that you believe in a set of propositions about God. One of the propositions about God is God's justice. We call it theodicy. That somehow the world is run in a fair way, and if you can't see it, then you don't know the mysteries of the divine. I've never believed it. It never meant much to me. Even as a young person, I could see the suffering of the innocent. But even as a young person, I always had a strong sense of the divine. So I just decided to never have to figure that out. So my own interreligious life is not one that has what we call propositional theology, meaning propositions about God pardon me, that if I affirm a set of propositions, I can call myself a believer. And if I don't affirm a set of propositions, then I'm a non-believer. I find that almost insulting to the integrity and depth of people who don't have what I call a propositional theology. It's a term well used. There are people who have propositions about God, and those who have something more of an interior knowledge of the divine. And therefore, when people say, "Do you believe in God?" I say, "I think I know God." What that means is I focus on the inner experience of the divine. People can say, "Well, how do you know you're experiencing God and not experiencing something within?" So here's my response to that. I don't know. I mean, it could be, after I die, I wake up and I realize, oh my God, there's nothing here. Let me go back to sleep. I don't know. Nobody knows if there's something on the other side of language. But I will say, when I have these inner experiences, there's no other word than the divine, than the word the holy, than inner transformation that describes what I experience. So I'm not going to not use a word because I can't account for it to a skeptic. And that's one reason I find it not very helpful to engage in conversations with people who disagree on something that doesn't really have a moral stake in it. If we're all going to be moral people, if you want to be an atheist, be an atheist. If I want to be a God knower, I'm a God knower. And it does not help either of us to argue about it because we end up taking what I call very wooden, very rigid kind of positions. So if we have permission to be God knowers, meaning we use terms like the divine, the holy, and God to refer to a set of inner experiences, even if there's nothing on the other side of the word God, there are still modes of consciousness that the term, the divine, the holy, describe that no other words describe. So when we use religious language, again, we don't have to affirm that there's a divine being on the other side of the words, but rather that the words help us cultivate different levels of consciousness. So instead of every time asking myself, well, do I really believe there is the divine that the word the divine points to, or does the word the divine point to a mode of consciousness? It doesn't really matter. I do believe personally that words like the holy divine refer to something, a metaphysical truth, and not just a subjective experience. There's no way to test that, and again, it doesn't matter. So one way that I understand religious language, and I consider most of the poems that we share on a Friday night to be religious language because they refer to a mode of consciousness. And therefore, to me, what it means to be a God knower is to engage in inner modes of consciousness that help me know something about the inner life that I would not know without these words. So I'm not saying that there is an eternal soul, that there is a divine. It doesn't really matter to me. That what matters to me is that religious language is efficacious, meaning I focus on efficacy rather than certainty. Is it useful? Is it efficacious in cultivating inner states that I don't access in normal states of consciousness? So there are times when I use these words to go into the soul to cultivate modes of experience, and terms like the divine, the holy, God, angels, revelation. These are the words that actually are evoked by those experiences. And to use our prior language, they're the words that form the root system that forms that for me gives my soul its, as it were, spiritual body. Okay, so when you read these Psalms, you come across the word God. And for example, especially in Psalm 119, there's a lot of terms of God's teaching. Now, this is not, the author here does not mean the five books of Moses. So what does the word Torah mean? You'll see the term often. The word Torah in Hebrew literally is from the word lehorot. And lehorot means to teach or instruct. So you take the verb root of lehorot and you turn it into a noun, it's a Torah, a teaching. It is equivalent to the Greek word logos. I share an anecdote. When I first arrived in Israel to the Hebrew University in 1980, walking around campus, and I saw a huge building that had on the outside of the building um, Torat HaNefesh, Torat HaNefesh, the teaching of the soul, or the logos of the soul, or the psychology department. Psyche means soul. Logos, of course, means the study of. So I thought, wow, Hebrew University, there's an entire department that's teaching Torah Nefesh, the teaching of the soul. I walk in, and of course, it's Freud and behavioral psychologist. I said, oh, psychology, I get it now, right? So the word Torah is a teaching. Now, remember, the term Torah did not always refer to the five books of Moses. They call it the Torah because it contained a teaching. The term for five books of Moses is Hamisha Chumshe Moshe, the five books of Moses. Torah means a teaching. So the author here in Psalm 119 does not mean the Torah. The author means the teaching. Same thing with the word mitzvah. Mitzvah does not refer to the so-called 613 mitzvot that every, let's say, Jew or Orthodox Jew is supposed to do. The Hebrew word litzavot has a sense of to instruct, as one of my colleagues put it, to urge someone to a course of action. One of my whose name I forget told me that they see the word mitzvah as an urging from the divine. I love that. So when you see the word Torah, think of a divine teaching. Well, how do you know it's a divine teaching? We're going back to inner experience. There are some times when I think, I ruminate, I consider, I go down deep inside, I come across, I engage in what I call the truth mind, and something happens, and I can feel a wisdom flowing in me and through me. And sometimes I feel I'm in the presence of the divine. I'm suffused with divine knowledge. So I'll call that Torah, a teaching from the divine. Again, when I'm reading it, I'm saying, well, this is really good, but it becomes a teaching when I internalize it. So when you read the word Torah here, think of a teaching that your soul adheres to, that your soul somehow deeply wants to connect with. You'll see the word dabkeni, that attach me to it. The soul has a kind of a natural inner attachment to truths, and for me, those comprise a Torah. In the same way, the word mitzvah does not mean a mitzvah that I have to observe, but rather a sacred intention of the divine coming my way. So one thing we have to do, from my perspective, when we study from Psalms, is take out the language, the Jewish religious language that was created during the Talmudic period, and try to go back to the language in the Bible itself, where the word Torah means a teaching. A mitzvah means a personal address from the divine to think, act, behave in a certain way. All right, and I'll give more prefaces as we go along to help open up the book of Psalms. So I'll just go through a few verses here, give my commentary, take a few questions, and then let's go on to Lydia's teaching. So in Psalm 119, verse 25, Davkal afar nafshi, my soul has cleaved to the dust. My soul has cleaved to the dust. Now, this reminds me of a counseling session I had a few years ago I still think about when I was a young writer, sought my counsel, and just was spiritually lost. Her mother studies with me. You might be here. Daughter said, talk to Rabbi Finley. She said, I'm not religious. I don't want to talk to a rabbi. She says, no, he's not that kind of rabbi. Talk to the guy. So we have a Zoom meeting, and she says to me, I said, so what's up? And she says, my life tastes like dust. My life tastes like dust. And of course, this came up. I said, tell me. She says, I have a good job. I have a wonderful partner. I consider myself to be a poet. I've lost access to my inner life. And if the poetry does not come through me, my life is not worth living. It is my life purpose. It gives meaning to my life, and I don't have it. And serious, utterly serious. It reminded me of many of the addicts that I've counseled over the years when I worked at a drug and rehab center. I remember one guy who he put it to me. He said, I feel the pain of life. I pour a quart of bourbon down my throat, and the next day it's still there. I was sitting with he and his wife both came in, and we went through a guided meditation. And the guided meditation put him in again, it's quite specific. So ignore the specifics and please capture the feeling of it. He's a Jewish poet sitting in a coffee house in Vienna in the early part of the 19th century, looking everything like a Viennese Jewish poet. He's speaking to other poets, and he's having a profound and deep experience. Through a guided meditation, he just got there, came out of. He said, "That is I. That is I." I said, "So do you write poetry?" He said, "Rabbi Finley, where I live, I'll say, up and coming, semi-affluent neighborhood." He said, "If I told people I wrote poetry, they'd laugh me out of my job. I can't tell anybody I wrote poetry." I said, "Well, what about your wife?" He said, "Tell you, Rabbi, I'm ashamed that I'm a poet." I said, "Have you ever written a poem?" He said, "No." He said, "If I wrote a poem, I'd become a real poet, and I would hate myself because, poets are effeminate and poets are weak and, and don't aren't cutthroat businessmen." And I'm summarizing a counseling session. I said, "Man, you're killing yourself." I said, so I introduced him to my favorite poets, and I actually read a few poems with him and his wife. And I said to his wife, I said, um, yeah, he might need rehab, but more than anything, he needs to read poetry. And you need to make sure he reads poetry. And I said, you need to come out of the closet. You need to just say to your friends, yeah, I'm a poet, guys. So you can ridicule me, you can not like me, but I'm a poet. And I stayed in touch for a while. And he again, this was years and years ago, but after a couple months, he didn't need me anymore. He lived in a rather distant city, and said, I'm on my way, and thank you. So look at this. His soul tasted like dust. That young woman's life tasted like dust. Her response was to consider ending her life. His response was to pour a quart of bourbon down his throat every day, as opposed to, for her, there was a very specific block. I actually talked about it extensively at High Holidays, as I'm remembering now. It's a very profound experience for me. I had to tell the story, and for this guy, his life tasted like dust, and he could only quench the dust with alcohol. So this word where it says davka, um, verse 25, davka nafshi le'afar nafshi. That's what I'll call an archetypal experience. Probably every person in here, you or your spouse or somebody has that experience. My life tastes like dust. My soul tastes like dust. I don't know how to medicate. I don't know how to get out of it. I can't feel any goodness in my life. You might say it's the classic depressive position, not depression brought on by the chemical structure of our body, but a real deep spiritual emptiness and crisis. Well, this person has been there in Psalm 119, verse 25. Then he says, Chayeni kidvarecha. Now, the word chayeni, you can hear the word chay in there, life. Lahachayot means to revive the dead. Chayeni is not a very uncommon word in Hebrew, but chayeni means to resuscitate me, revive me, or more directly, give me life. Um, uh, Chayeni kidvarecha, in accordance with your word. But kidvarecha would be some also means something like, as your words give life, let them give life to me. Kidvarecha can also mean similar to. So just try to imagine that in moments when your soul attaches to dust, that there's a divine word, some teaching, maybe some epigram that can revive you, give you life. So, and by the way, in both cases, with the poet who was drinking, it was poetry that saved him. Again, the last time we talked. With the woman whose life tasted like dust, we studied the Duino elegies, and it broke through the writer's block, and the 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 terror of beauty was revived, and her poetry began to flow. So try to imagine that people whose lives taste like dust, what they're in search of is meaning, and meaning is given through some kind of powerful transformative word. And this is one thing that I would teach in my rehab group. I mean, everybody did 12 steps because they had to in a rehab, but I more taught about movies, poetry, stories, etc., as a way of dealing with addiction. Now, I was um, not in the mainstream, but I was hired because I was not in the mainstream. So I just want you to think for a moment, consider the idea that if my soul adheres to dust is a metaphor for that which gives rise to addiction, that some kind of holy word or teaching can be the response. Drachai siparti, I've told you my pathways. Like you're confessing to God. Here's what it's like in here. And this is also, I think, a big part of Rabbi Nachman's practice is whatever's happening within, you speak it into the soul of the universe. If someone says, well, I don't know if God's listening, I said, it doesn't matter. What matters is you're saying it, and there might be some chamber of the soul that is equivalent to the divine that's listening. He says, Drachai siparti v'ta'aneni. And you answer me, lamdeni chukecha. So I recite what's happening inside of me. I recite the painful journey my soul is on. And this is v'ta'aneni. And you respond to me. Teach me your statutes. And again, that's what happens with me. As I finally say, okay, what's the root of my suffering? What's happening within me? And I go inside. And in Rabbi Nachman practice, it's called Hishtapchut Nefesh. This is also the outpouring of the soul. It refers to another soul. I'm just going to say into the, into the heart of the universe, what's happening inside of me. Silence, Vita'anini, and you respond. And the response is, teach me your statutes. There's some chok chaim, there's some kind of law of life that I'm looking for. So in my despair, in my being lost, there's a teaching voice that responds. And this is, again, so of course with my experience, once I take the time to go into the depth of my soul and speak it, and I'm quiet, something reaches out back to me. Now, is it God? It feels like it. And again, it's not a verbal revelation. It's like God speaks to me. It's like an experience happens within me, and then it forms around words. Sometimes it forms around resolve. Something that I thought about now turns into a firm resolve of something I need to do or stop doing. Um, uh, Moving on, Derech Pikudecha Habineni, the path of your, now Pukudim is another word for a mitzvah. The Hebrew word for your army commander is a mifaked. Suddenly the instruction arises as you must do this, or you must stop doing that. And then he says, Derech Pekuchecha Habineni, help me understand the way of your divine instruction. I like this word, Habineni, help me understand it. And part of saying, help me understand it is a call, again, either for the divine or some deep part of the soul. I want to understand myself. I want to understand what teachings I need. I want to understand the way out of here. And it says, Va'asicha niflotecha, and then I will talk about this wondrous moment. It says here, I will discuss your miracles, but for me, the miracle is the relief that I started with my soul is attached to dust. I go into that deep part of myself. I talk about what's happening inside of me. Vita'aneni, a teaching begins to emerge, and then I want to understand what is happening here. Maybe I'll just do one a little bit of verse. Uh, um, I'm going to jump ahead to verse 29. Derech sheker haser mimeni, v'toratecha chaneni. The way, remove from me derech sheker, the way of the lie. V'toratecha chaneni. Maybe I should say choneni. Now, this term, the way of the lie, it is probably, I remember reading about the in spiritual psychology, the way of the lie, even when I was in high school. um, uh, especially appropriate for a teenager, is that a teenager, to deal with adolescence, finds a false self. They present a false self to the world. They're hiding, of course, their pain of adolescence. They take on an identity. They start to fund the identity with their energy as a way of not looking within. Teenagers are not taught poetry. I mean, if you are, I was taught poetry and I got a D in literature when I was a senior in high school. Trying to still figure that out. Um, one would have thought. Uh, um, I'm trying to think if I had something like this. I mean, we're not flooded with adolescents, but it would be good for them to come to our sessions and hear poetry and see adults, you know, filling their souls with, with words of the divine. So try to imagine at some point we cultivate a false self. We believe in the false self, and nothing in life sinks in deeply because we're so busy keeping up the pretense. So whoever wrote this knows of the idea of the big lie of the false self. And he says, Derech sheker haser mimeni, take it away from me. Take it away from me. So this is somebody who said, yeah, my soul attaches to dust because I'm living a lie. Because I have this derech sheker. I'm living a lie. I'm not living a real self. And people saying, I can't get it off of me. I keep going back to it. I keep being this false person, and I'm not. And saying to that divine force, Haser mimeni, take it off of me, take it away from me. Again, which could be just, some deeper part of the soul where you say to that part of the soul, I'm done living a lie. I'm done living a false person. I'm done with the act. I don't know what my authentic self is, but I know this is not it. I want to be more real. So this is a cry for me for authenticity. And he says, V'toratacha choneni. Now here we have the word Torah. It doesn't mean the five books of Moses. It means there's a teaching. Grace me with a teaching. So think about this. My soul attaches to dust. There's a teaching that I need. We go to here, person suddenly realizes their soul. This is not everybody, but in this case, my soul attaches to dust because I'm living a lie. I don't know who I am, but I know it's not this. And then you say, there's a teaching for me. I don't, I can't get to the teaching. Grace me with the teaching. And this idea of divine grace, again, is a thoroughly deep Jewish idea. I was taught egregiously wrongly in high school that grace was a Christian idea and Judaism was justice. Well, Judaism has both justice and grace, and Christianity has both grace and justice. But here, the idea of I just want to be graced with meaning I want to enjoy a kind of a divine favor where I have knowledge that I have not yet earned. We might call it the achievement of implicit knowledge. Where I have a realization that I've had a quantum leap in my self-understanding as a human being, a quantum leap in my understanding the human condition. It's a moment of divine grace. And he says, here I am mired in the way of the lie, and just asking for a moment of divine grace, a teaching of grace. In fact, one of the way to refer to the Torah is a matnat chinam, is a gracious gift. And here it's again, this is in the Psalms, and even in Christianity, where they would say, Jesus was the Logos. This is in the Gospel of John, that was incarnated, and through a gracious act of God, people can find, salvation from the word salve, healing. Well, the structure of this idea is in Psalms, that we live lives in disrepair. Remember, the word salvation comes from salve, just as in Hebrew, the word lehoshia means to save, but also a kind of a spiritual salve, a spiritual healing. And it can come from assiduous work, and it also can come from moments of divine grace and the divine providing the salve. Oh, that's another thing. Sometimes instead of saying salvation, I say salve. Look at what a different feeling it has, right? My soul is hurting. I need a salve. If I said my soul's hurting, I want salvation, it sounds like I want some kind of religious answer. But when I say I need a salve, it becomes more purely spiritual in the sense of a divine presence that brings healing to my soul. Um, Let's see. Now, if we go to verse 31, I'm skipping here, in the interest of time. Davakti be'edutecha. We take the same word that the psalm that this section began with, verse 25 began, Davka la'afar nafshi, my soul has cleaved to dust. He uses the same word as if he's gone through a process in writing this section. Davakti be'edutecha, I am now cleaved to your edut. Now, the Hebrew word edut means something like testimony. It's a synonym for Torah. Edut, by the way, is connected to the word edah, which means a community. So we might call it, again, I'm reaching here a bit, the truths that a community lives by. Meaning we live by, as it were, testimonials. We know that this will work. And some of the so-called testimonies, and again, I think this refers to some kind of communal knowledge. He says, I am cleaving to your testimonies, or in my mind, that to which people say it works. This group of people who are giving, adding to the fund of our knowledge, giving testimony, as it were. We're witnessing to the fact that there are some spiritual paths that actually bring us out of these spiritual pits. And he says, Davakti be'edotecha, Adonai al tevisheni. Now, this is a strange phrase. I want to unpack it. Adonai al tevisheni, Adonai, do not bring me into shame. He doesn't mean that God shames us. I've talked about this idea of shame a lot, maybe even in the last holiday, if I'm not mistaken. That if shame means an experience of one's utter worthlessness, shame meaning that you're somehow insufficient for life, and to say to the divine, Al Tavisheni, it's as if that a connection with the divine affords a person with a deep, profound, foundational sense of worth. No matter what you've done, no matter what you've thought, no matter what you haven't done, if you haven't found the success you want, you haven't found this worldly affirmation of who you are, there's an affirmation of you that is is found internally. So to say Adonai al tavisheni is like, don't say, Adonai, don't let me feel shame. Don't let me feel my life is worthless. Don't let me feel that I'm an insufficient human being. And we find this in our liturgy and many other parts, that the self-worth that comes from knowledge of God, that is meaning whatever else I am, I'm a God knower. Even further, whatever else I am, I'm loved by God. I have essential worth that comes from God. No matter if other people don't like me or love me, I'm loved by the heart of the universe. And starting in there, and then lo nevot le'olam va'ed. With that knowledge, we never experience shame, because we have an utter deep sense of worth when we engage in these kinds of meditations. And then it ends with derech mitzvotecha arutz. I will run toward the way of your divine sacred urgings. Ki tarchib libi. They widen my heart. This idea of the heart being widened. You have in Hebrew the idea of merchavia, the wideness of God. So instead of being pressured, constricted, there's an opening. So I will run toward your sacred urgings, because they give a spaciousness to my heart. All right, so one reason I love this little section. Oh, by the way, if you're reading in Hebrew, you'll know that one of the verses from Psalm 119, 25 to 32 begin with the Daled. Davka la'afar nafshi, chayeni kidvarecha, derachai siparti, v'ta'aneni lamdeni chukecha, derech pekudecha havineni, v'asicha niflotecha, dalfa nafshi, etc. So these are all meditations on the letter Daled. So one of the nice things about Psalm 119, it's an acrostic, but not an acrostic of one verse at a time. It's groups of verses that begin with Aleph and go all the way through the Hebrew alphabet, several verses devoted to one letter each. So there, all right. So I'm going to let you in on a secret, not secret, an odd little Jewish superstition that when you arrive at the gates of heaven, God will say, "What is your name?" And people forget who they are. They're just, "Wait, I'm here. I don't know anything about myself. What have I been doing with my life?" So they say, what you do is you go to Psalm 119 and you memorize a verse that is the first letter of your name, and you memorize a verse that is the last letter of your name. So me, Mordechai, I memorize a mem verse and a yud verse. So when God says, "What is your name?" all I have to do is remember my two verses. Okay. So you can all take the letters of your name, and hopefully there's a Hebrew one. So I had a mem verse. I'll share with you what it is. It's been a while since I thought about this. My mem verse is Psalm 119. Um, let's see, this would be 97. Tzadi Vav. Ma ahavti toratecha, kol hayom hisichati. Oh, I love your teaching. Kol hayom hisichati. I talk about it all day. So when I was in my 20s, when I discovered this, I thought, okay, I have to do that now. So everybody that I bumped in, I said, "So what verse are you studying? What are you doing?" Ma ahavti toratecha, kol hayom hisichati. I talk about it all day. So everybody I met, "What are you studying lately?" People say, "Oh, that's actually a great way to start a conversation. What are you studying? What are you reading? What's your new poem? What's your new verse?" You quickly find out how to alienate people, how to, yeah, not make friends and influence people because they see you come, I'm going the other way. Anyway, so there was a time I remember down when I was at USC, everybody would go, "What are you studying?" Lama, Mahavti Toratecha, Kol Yom Sikati. So that was my mem. Let me see if I remember my yud. See what jumps out on me. No, it's not jumping out at me. It must not have meant as much. Anyway, so play around this. Whatever your name is, if it doesn't fit into Hebrew, there's an equivalent. There's a Hebrew way to say any name. And then so I see we have a Justin here, if I'm not mistaken. So the Justin is a gimel with a chupchik, so it's a gimel. And so you'd go to the verses that start with the gimel, and that's the ones I went on last time, by the way. Last week I did the gimel verses. Gal einai va'abita, roll back my eyes that I may peer into the wonder of your teaching. That's the gimel of Psalm 119, verse 17. And verse 18, Ger anochi ba'aretz, I'm a stranger walking around in this land. Al taster mimeni mitzvotecha, do not hide from me your divine instruction. So if your name starts with a G or a J, you go there. So whatever your first name is, see if you can find a Hebrew reader who can point you to the section, and then you study the verses there. And I almost guarantee one's going to stick to you, and you memorize it. And when you arrive at the gates of heaven, it won't be Saint Peter, but it's something like this. So, "What's your name?" You say, Mahavti Toratecha, calling you. Okay, you get it. So just be ready for that entrance exam. All right, that's my teaching for today. And Lydia,